Thank you, Daniel, and thank all of you for having me here and letting me come to this rather magnificent city, which I truly appreciate. I'm going to open this panel by talking a little about press coverage because it's what I do, and what I have done throughout my career is communications and press strategy. And I want to talk a little about why many of you are probably quite surprised that the United States is looking seriously at a potential Donald Trump candidacy, presidency, or at least he's competitive. And based on what you've read, you probably can't understand how it could have happened. Peter and Stan are the pollsters, the data people, and they will go into all of this. But I'm going to talk about it from a communications perspective and from a press coverage perspective, because what we have seen in 2016 is a lot of the old rules by which we designed communication strategy for campaigns have been radically changed. And Donald Trump has been part of that change. So I want to talk, first of all, about what the press missed during the primaries. And this is short, but it gives some context for this. If you followed the American primary process, the nominating process, which began a year and a half ago, so I know our campaigns are really long, they last forever, they're extremely expensive, and it feels as though they will never end. But this one did begin roughly a year and a half ago. But if you were just to roll back the clock a year ago, okay, so July of 2015, Jeb Bush or Scott Walker were the front runners for the Republican nomination, with some people thinking that Rand Paul, a senator from Kentucky, might have an outside chance. Donald Trump, who had announced his candidacy a month earlier, was seen as a reality TV star joke who was running to market his brand. And I realize there are people who still believe that is true. The experts did not believe he had a chance. At the same time, Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State, former United States Senator from New York, and former First Lady of the United States, was seen as someone who not only would have no competition for the Democratic nomination, but she was also seen as somebody who would probably have no real competition in the general election. Now, as we went through the process, we all know that all of those assumptions that drove press coverage turned out to be wildly wrong. Donald Trump, despite early in his campaign doing things like calling Senator John McCain a coward, for example, and this was a war hero, announcing that he wanted to build a wall along the southern border of the United States to keep out all immigrants, that he wanted to deport 13 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, and that he wanted to ban Muslims from being able to enter the country, despite things that put him what was outside the political mean of the United States, that were seen as outlandish statements that one by itself would be enough to sink a conventional candidate, not only didn't implode, as we like to say, but he actually gained strength. At the same time, Hillary Clinton's only somewhat viable challenger was a socialist who was not even a member of the Democratic Party until he began running for president, and a socialist which in the United States, until quite recently, had some very bad connotations in our political process. A socialist senator from Vermont who was 74 years old, okay? And so as we went through the primary process, the conventional candidates, Jeb Bush, Scott Walker, Marco Rubio, who were spending huge amounts of money, fell by the wayside as Donald Trump continued to move forward and to attract general election Republican voters to participate in primaries. And Hillary Clinton ran into totally unexpected problems in terms of her candidacy and ended up still not endorsed by Bernie Sanders, although reportedly that may happen next week in New Hampshire. But we will see if the events in the United States perhaps put that off. Anyway, She was not able to put him away until June. He raised over $200 million. And an interesting thing happened in terms of the United States politics, which was in the Democratic Party, the single best indicator of how you were going to vote for a primary candidate was not gender, was not your level of college education, was not your race, but it was your age. Because it turns out that our younger voters actually don't think socialism is such a bad thing. And if you were under 45, the odds were you were going to be a Bernie Sanders voter, and if you were over 45, you were going to be a Hillary Clinton voter. So both of these campaigns took very unlikely turns in the course of the nominating process. The pundits were wrong every single time. And why is that? Because our press corps covers political campaigns by the rules that reigned in the previous political campaign. Many of our politicians do this as well, but for the press it's more serious because they cover these races from a lens of what worked last time. And of course, we all know communications is constantly innovating faster than the media is innovating right now. And because of this, the press is fighting the last war, and successful campaigns are actually mapping out the future when it comes to campaigning and communications. That was the case for Sanders, and it certainly has been the case for Donald Trump, who has taught the American political system that it is possible to win a nomination spending less money than any candidate in the field, spending less money than anybody else who was running for that Republican primary. Less money on television advertising, less money on organization, less money. So immediately, one of the assumptions we make about primaries, that the candidate who raises the most money will win, is totally wrong. This is relevant for the general election as well. The second thing that happened in the course of this was the idea that Hillary Clinton was going to have an enormous gender advantage in the primaries was absolutely incorrect. Again, age was the determinative factor. So as the primaries came to a close and the nominating process came to a close, everyone was sitting around saying, how did this happen? The Republican Party nominated Donald Trump despite the fact that business interests who fund the Republican Party did not want him nominated, that the leadership of the Republican Party in both the House and the Senate basically said he was unqualified to be president, that many of the mainstream members of his own party do not support him, and that the press as a whole in the United States, including the right-wing press, attacks him on a continual basis. And of course, he is an undisciplined candidate who gives people a lot of room to attack him. So everything that was predicted during the primaries was actually wrong. And part of the misunderstanding came from misreading polls, and I think that this is an important thing because people are doing it again. These are not national elections. Just as national polls in a primary only really tell you name ID at any given point or what people are reading in the press, national polls in a general election really don't measure what is going to happen because we have this crazy thing called the Electoral College in the United States. So it matters what states you win, not if you win the national election. In 2000, Al Gore won more popular votes and lost the presidency. This happens in the United States occasionally. It's never very popular when it happens, but it does indeed happen, and it's totally valid under our rules. So as you look at national polls showing that Hillary Clinton has roughly a 4 to 5 point average lead, that's kind of irrelevant. Battleground states are more relevant, but this is not what the press is really looking at right now. The role of money is very misunderstood in races as well. Money is not determinative, especially in presidential races, for the simple reason that press coverage and social media tend to dominate money when it comes to the presidential campaign. It doesn't mean it's not important, but it is not determinative the way that races that don't get as much attention depend on money to really communicate to voters. All this race is about is communication. In fact, the Pew Research poll published this week shows that a record number of Americans are closely following this race already in July of the election year, the highest number they've ever recorded in a Pew poll for closely following an election at this point, 63%. So money is not the only thing. Now, the dynamics of press coverage, which is what I have done for a living for 35 years. Okay, where does their information come from? Their information comes primarily from people who work on campaigns. And because the people who work on campaigns got this race totally wrong, the press, by and large, got this race totally wrong. And as we go into the general election, the people that the reporters talk to are still the same people who didn't understand the dynamic in the primary and are unlikely to truly understand the dynamic in the general election. How does the information circulate? We talk about PAC journalism in the United States, and even though our press corps would like to believe it doesn't exist any longer, it exists more than ever because of the speed of news coverage. I don't have to tell all of you what the internet has done in terms of both accuracy, fact-checking, and the need for posting something first, whether or not it's actually true. And that has been the thematic of the 2016 campaign, has been this need for speed with a very low tolerance for fact-checking what candidates say or what reporters are putting on the web and in the newspapers. So information circulates that's not true, but it becomes true if it's not challenged, because as people Google these articles, they start repeating whatever's in them, right? And all of a sudden you have bad facts become predictions. The third thing is the effect of ratings pressures on cable TV. Donald Trump is about ratings. He was a successful television star in the United States. The show The Apprentice, I don't know if anyone here ever saw it. I will confess I did not, but many Americans did. Huge numbers of Americans did. He understands television, and news directors understand ratings, and Donald Trump is ratings. So it is estimated that during the primaries, he had roughly $1 billion worth of television given to him free through coverage. That continues into this general election. And then finally, the press qualitative judgments. And I think you saw a little of this in the coverage of Brexit, at least in the United States we saw it, which is our press making a qualitative judgment about what they think should happen, and therefore the coverage gearing towards what they think will happen, as opposed to a dispassionate look at the facts on the ground. I will say, from a United States perspective, the last week of the Brexit coverage said the polls are so close, Remain will win. Now, if the polls are so close, how do you know who's going to win, right? But there was an unwillingness to really confront the idea that the United Kingdom would actually vote to exit the EU, and therefore the close polls could only lead to one result. And I think if you look at the coverage of the presidential campaign, you will see something very similar happening right now, which is the battleground states are very close, therefore Hillary Clinton will win. Okay, well, if the battleground states are really close, there's a good possibility that Donald Trump could win as well. I think less likely, but still not impossible, right? So I would just say that as you go forward, the key things to keep an eye on, the conventions. Conventions are always important. These conventions even more important because they are the best chance for candidates to make their case to the United States and to the world on a relatively unfiltered way, okay, directly to voters. And the story they tell is an important one. The Obama conventions, both 2008 and 2012, were critical for framing the general election. And in 2008 were critical for really giving people of the United States a comfort level about voting for a candidate who did not look like a typical candidate for the presidency of the United States. Donald Trump's convention can go a long way towards making people feel more comfortable with the idea of voting for him, or it could end up being a disaster. Who knows, right? It's Donald Trump in live television. The Democratic convention, I think I can honestly say, will probably be a very well choreographed one. The VP choice, very important for candidates, right? And how it gets covered. Did Trump help himself? Did he hurt himself? Did Hillary help? Did she hurt? But that, again, will be a very important signal to voters and to the press. And the way the press plays it will be an important signal to voters. And finally, debates. Debates are the one time where people get the opportunity to see these candidates side by side. And debates are important, but coverage of debates is more important. In 2012, part of my job as part of the debate team was to spend a huge amount of time figuring out how we were going to be picking those moments from the debates we wanted to push out onto social media, whether it was Mitt Romney talking about how he had binders full of women to choose from when we attacked him on not having enough women on his staff. There were all kinds of moments from that campaign, from those debates, and those are really critically important. So finally, I will just say that in terms of the general election, what you're going to see is paid advertising, not as important as the earned media. You will see the earned media continuing to be in its kind of consolidation of elites, self-circulating cycle of repeating things to each other and having a lot of trouble breaking out of it to figure out what's actually happening in the country, which Pete and Stan will talk about in a second. You're going to see, as you have seen already, record numbers of Americans who say they are unhappy with their choice for the presidency, and potentially third-party candidate, Gary Johnson, the Libertarian, or Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, getting included in at least one debate, which will change the dynamic. Those of you from the United Kingdom remember with the debates in 2010, what happened when the Liberal Democrats got included. It changed the dynamic enormously. And then finally, communications continues to be an additive process for campaigns. More platforms. For instance, in 2008, when the Obama campaign was pushing the envelope in terms of technology, Twitter didn't exist, or it was like an infant, okay? We did not use Twitter. In 2012, Twitter is kind of out there. In 2016, Twitter has actually been Donald Trump's major way of communicating with the American people and his cable interviews. So it's an additive process. As communications professionals, we can't get rid of anything, right? We can't say, oh, we don't have to do radio any longer. Oh, we don't have to talk to print reporters any longer. Oh, we don't care about television or opinion writers. They're all still very important, but every single platform that gets added. So what you will see in the general election will be both campaigns pushing into new platforms in as many ways as they possibly can. But I think you will see the Trump campaign continue to play a leadership role in terms of revolutionizing the way candidates talk to the American people, for good or for worse. So with that, I'll turn it over to Pete, who will explain what all that means.